this new situation that Israel finds itself as something of a pariah, really, in the views of many. And I don't say that lightly or with any relish.
If Ben Gvir and Smotrich got their way and they reoccupy Gaza and they reoccupy the West Bank and they ban all Palestinians, do I believe that Israel is a safer country and that the Jewish homeland is more secure? Absolutely not.
Just in terms of Netanyahu's own stated aims, I'm at a loss. But what I think is so tragic about what Netanyahu has done, and is now proposing to accelerate and intensify, is to blacken Israel's name.
Cities like broken skeletons laid waste by war. Graveyards of life and lives. The streets, homes and coffee houses of old now cast to the ground.
That is Emma Murphy from ITN's News at 10 last night. A report of her overflying Gaza with the Jordanian Air Force as they're preparing to drop aid by parachutes onto the wasteland that is now Gaza.
In the last 24 hours, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, has briefed his cabinet that he intends not to scale down the war, not to reduce pressure, but that he wants to take over Gaza in its entirety, arguing that Hamas still poses an existential threat to Israel. But after 20 months of endless bloodshed, of humanitarian disaster, and given Hamas is still there, isn't this just Einstein's definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
From Benjamin Netanyahu's office has gone a message to the head of the IDF, the head of the Israeli Defense Forces, to plan for this idea of the full occupation of the Gaza Strip. Now, until now, we have seen that action has been pretty extensive. Just look at the pictures from over Gaza and you can see the scale of the destruction. But that they're going to try now to go into areas where the last remaining hostages may be held. And there had been a sort of cordon sanitaire around those areas for fear of putting those hostages' lives at risk. But now, as Lewis was saying, nearly 2 years on from October the 7th, Benjamin Netanyahu wants to go further in his bid to dislodge Hamas from its military and political control of the Gaza Strip.
I think what many people will find extraordinary, certainly what I find extraordinary, is the idea that after all of this time, after everything that we've seen happen in Gaza, that Netanyahu's response and the Israeli government's response would be, let's go a bit further. Let's turn the screws even more. Particularly when you consider, leave aside the humanitarian situation, which we know is appalling, is dire. We know civilians are getting killed routinely on a daily basis. We know that kids are suffering from extreme malnutrition, and indeed many experts say widespread famine. Leave that aside for 1 second if you can. But just in terms of Netanyahu's own stated aims, I'm at a loss. I'm at a loss because after 20 months of endless warfare, what can you do that you haven't already done? I mean, most international experts and military experts and critics at home say that Hamas is already decimated. Its leaders are mostly dead. Its arsenal is severely depleted, if not completely exhausted. And indeed, don't take my word for this or anybody's word here. I am very struck by Israeli internal criticism of Netanyahu's government, because it can be very tempting, or we can fall into the trap of sort of just talking about Israel and Netanyahu as if they're sort of synonymous and his government is synonymous, which they're not. Take a look at what has happened on Monday. So what happened yesterday, very, very rare intervention. More than 600 retired Israeli security officials, including 19 former heads of intelligence agencies. These aren't some sort of lily-livered liberals out there. These are people who epitomise the Israeli state, who have worked at the centre of the Israeli state, released a video urging President Trump to tell the Israeli government to end the war in Gaza. They said, it is our professional judgment that Hamas no longer poses a strategic threat to Israel. This war started as a just war, they said. It was a defensive war. But once we achieved all the military objectives, once we achieved a brilliant military victory against all our enemies, the war stopped being a just war. It is leading the state of Israel to the loss of its security and identity. So if they're saying that, if they're saying that they've won already, what is Netanyahu really hoping to achieve?
Okay, let's put it in its worst possible light of what Netanyahu is trying to achieve. He's trying to stay in the saddle a little bit longer. He's trying to stave off the threat of prosecution in this corruption inquiry. Yesterday, we know he tried to sack his Attorney General, who was the person leading the investigation into the wrongdoing. He's tried to fire him, and the Supreme Court of Israel says, sorry, you can't do that. You haven't got the authority or the power to do that. And there is now an appeal going to the Supreme Court, which will be heard in due course in Israel, of whether Netanyahu can do that. I suppose the other thing is that, you know, Hamas still seem to have some degree of command and control in Gaza, even after all the destruction. We have seen the statement from, and I think this was significant last week, from Arab League members, Egypt, Qatar, others, saying Hamas has to disarm and has to relinquish political control and get out of there before there can be any sort of peace settlement. But what does that peace settlement look like? And what does it look like if Israel is taking over control? And, you know, a lot of this goes back to almost the flippancy of Donald Trump in the early days, where he was saying, yeah, you know, get rid of all the Palestinians from Gaza. And he posted that really appalling AI video of him and Netanyahu in sun loungers with dollars raining down on the Gaza Riviera. And you can see that for a lot of people in Israel, on the ideological hard right, that was not seen as a joke. That was seen as an invitation.
Look, I think John, you just put your finger on it. And actually, I think this is what is most disturbing about Netanyahu in particular. I think there are people in his government who are mad. I think they're genuinely mad. I think they're ideologically crazed. There are far-right people in his government that are so indifferent to human life. We get very caught up, I think, in this question about calling it a genocide or not, and the technicality of that and the legal definition. In a way, I agree with what Bernie Sanders said about this, which is you can argue about that all day long. It doesn't get you very far. What I think we can all say is that much of the action which has taken place and the indifference to Palestinian life, which has become more and more self-evident, is monstrous. It's monstrous because we're in a situation where children are being killed, apparently indiscriminately. Again, this is well documented by not only journalists but international organisations. And Netanyahu, I think what is particularly awful or despicable even about what Netanyahu is doing is not that he actually believes that Hamas can be destroyed. You can't achieve security. And Netanyahu, I think, knows this. You can't achieve long-term security down the barrel of a gun. Look to endless international, internal political problems, and you see evidence of that. In our own country, Northern Ireland, how did the IRA stop being a threat to the British state and to British citizens? It wasn't when we sent 30,000 troops into Northern Ireland. It was when there was a political settlement. Netanyahu knows this, but we know that he is thinking and is motivated by his short-term political future to stay in office for as long as possible. And to prize that above not only, never mind Gaza, but actually the security of his own country is a truly, I think, appalling act. And again, this doesn't require me to say this. This is all being said by people in Israel. There are not least the hostage families who are deeply hostile to Netanyahu. But you're even seeing, I noted, reading in Haaretz today, the Israeli newspaper, that we're in a situation now where actually Israel is even starting to struggle to get some of his own soldiers, the IDF, to return to Gaza. Yeah. They are exhausted by the operation. They no longer see the utility in the operation. And, you know, you've got full-time soldiers who are deep patriots. You know, you could not be more patriotic than these soldiers who are in the IDF, who, you know, whatever one thinks, I mean, obviously there will always be bad actors. Many will feel that they are doing their patriotic duty, doing what their government is saying, increasingly saying that they won't go back. 3 conscripts sentenced to jail last month for refusing to re-enter Gaza on mental health grounds, prompting a public outcry that led to the cancellation of their jail terms. Netanyahu isn't just increasingly setting himself against Gaza, against international public opinion, which we should talk about, but against many in his own country.
Look, you said it was monstrous, and you said Benjamin Netanyahu is not Israel. Both of those statements are true. An equally effective way of undermining Hamas, rather than starving the Palestinian people, would have been to put so much food and aid into Gaza that actually undermines the scarcity that Hamas could create and therefore have control over. If you just flood the zone with as much food and aid as you could possibly ever wish for, then Hamas is undermined in having that political control of controlling the food supply. And so that would have been a very effective way of doing it, instead of which they've gone for the opposite. And so what you've got now is an ever-growing gap, it feels to me, between the Israeli government, which is acting out of this narrow self-interest, as you define it. I mean, mad? I mean, yeah, I think the policy that they're going for is mad. I say this as someone Jewish. I don't think that if Ben-Gvir and Smotrich got their way, and they reoccupy Gaza, and they reoccupy the West Bank, and they ban all Palestinians, do I believe that Israel is a safer country and that the Jewish homeland is more secure? Absolutely not. I think it puts Israel more at risk. I think the hatreds will be even greater. I think the demand for vengeance will be swift, and it would be painful in the long run. So I think that, rather than people keeping quiet about this, I think people need to speak up for some of what is happening in Israel right now in the name of the Israeli government. I don't know whether they're mad or not, but they are bloody dangerous in what they are doing. And Netanyahu seems to be going along with, as you say, Lewis, he's a much more sophisticated politician than that. But it seems that short-term survival is the all-important thing, and doing enough to keep Donald Trump on board.
Yeah, I mean, what some of these people are is that they think that they have a generational, maybe even once in a century opportunity to achieve the aims that they've always wanted to do. So some of these people, I think, including, I mean, you mentioned Ben-Gvir, the Israeli security minister, I think they're sort of drunk on the opportunity that they have. I mean, as evidence for that, in the last 24 hours, Ben-Gvir choosing, out of nowhere, to visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem. Now, people don't know about that. It's the third most holy site in Islam. There has been a decades-old status quo arrangement with Muslim authorities, the Palestinians, that the Al-Aqsa compound is administered by a Jordanian religious foundation and Jews can visit but may not pray there. He decided with some of his followers, just go and pray there and let everybody know that he'd done it. Now, this might seem innocuous to us who are not sort of drenched in the history of this, but it is not innocuous to Muslims, to the Muslim world, to the Arab world. And what it is doing, it feels as if they want to show that they are at this moment of maximal power, that they're rubbing others, Muslims' face in their power. And this is this is dangerous. Your word is right, John. And by the way, I'm saying all of this, and it is always important to reassert. I talk about some of the Israeli actions being monstrous. Well, obviously, what Hamas has done is monstrous. What happened on October the 7th is monstrous. But the point is that what Israel has done and is now proceeding or arguing that they will continue to do is to empower Hamas further, and not just empower Hamas. And I say this as someone who I'm pro-Israel in the same way that I'm pro-Palestine. I don't want there to be a contradiction between those two things. There ought not to be a contradiction between those things. Any person who I think is reasonable and looks at this situation, this long historic situation, with logic and reason, would be in that position. But what I think is so tragic about what Netanyahu has done, and is now proposing to accelerate and intensify, is to blacken Israel's name. The state of Israel, which had previously, in decades gone by, been a symbol of hope for so many and of democratic, liberal tolerance for so many, is to blacken its image and its name in the international community, where actually saying that you are a friend and ally of Israel becomes problematic. And that hasn't been done at Hamas's hand. That's been done at Netanyahu's hand, because he has managed to alienate through the actions of his own government and with what has happened in Palestine, with the killing and maiming and starving of innocents. It is inevitable that is going to tarnish Israel's reputation for perhaps a generation. Just look at the polling. Again, don't take my word for it. Look at the polling of it, particularly among young people around the world. And that is not easily recoverable. And it's all very well for ardent Israeli hawks in the West, or for people in the Israeli government to turn around and say, that's an appalling thing. You're rewarding Hamas by taking that position, by being so anti-Israel. You have done it. You have done it by acting in the way that you have done. None of this is easy. Nothing would have been easy after October the 7th. But if you think back to the solidarity and sympathy that Israel rightly enjoyed in the wake of October the 7th, that has been squandered, not by Hamas, but by Netanyahu and his government.
And, what has been so extraordinary and jarring these past sort of appalling nearly 2 years since October the 7th, which, it was terrible. I mean, terrible what happened on October
Horrendous.
the 7th. Is that you've seen the cleverness of Israel in terms of the way it has undermined Hezbollah, the way it has weakened Iran, the sort of axis of kind of the firewall around Israel has been weakened enormously, with clever pinpoint precision strikes, with unbelievable intelligence gathered, with real targeted attacks. And you look at what they are doing in Gaza and you think, oh my God, what is this all about? And seeing starving children is just beyond the pale.
Well, I mean, to try to reinforce what I said when I talk about the alienation of international public opinion, which politician has called Israeli actions in Gaza a genocide? Obviously, one thinks of Jeremy Corbyn or Zara Sultana or perhaps Hamza Yusuf and so on. Who else on the American side? Not just AOC, not Bernie Sanders. Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yeah.
Now, if you've lost Marjorie Taylor Greene, right, then I think that does tell you something about what has happened to the image of Israel in the international community.
And that has another important consequence, because Donald Trump wants to keep the MAGA base happy. And there are splits emerging, understandably, rightly, who are saying, you know what, Israel, we love you, we support you. You are just going way too far right now, and this needs to stop. You need to get food into the population of Gaza. You need to rethink what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that this is reflective, this new situation that Israel finds itself as something of a pariah, really, in the views of many. And I don't say that lightly or with any relish. It's reflective of, you can see the conundrum that Starmer faces. Starmer in suggesting that he'll recognise Palestine, which was a huge step, albeit a conditional one, getting much criticism, which I can understand from people who say, look, this is rewarding Hamas. Hamas will be jubilant about this, that you are rewarding them for their heinous crimes on October the 7th. But again, it doesn't consider what Israel has done since October the 7th to put Starmer in that position. It is not a position that Starmer wanted to be in or to be doing it in this way. But such is the political revulsion, not just within the Labour coalition, but look at the polling, that the British public is actually generally horrified by what they're seeing in terms of Israeli actions in Gaza. There is such now political pressure to do something, anything, to make a gesture, to recognise that suffering, that given Netanyahu is not willing to do anything to listen certainly to any European governments, the only card that Starmer really has to play is recognition of the Palestinian state at a time when Hamas, undoubtedly a terrorist organisation, is still at the heart of whatever is left of the Palestinian state. But that's not Starmer's fault. That's the fault of the situation in which he finds himself, which is not of his making. It is a situation largely made, as I say, by Netanyahu himself.
Look, the 19-year-old John Sopel went and worked on a kibbutz between Afula and Bet Shan in Israel. I went because I was slightly kind of interested in the whole idea of the idealism of the kibbutz movement, the equality, everyone mucking in, no one earning any more than anybody else. It just seemed like a dream. And there were young people from all over the world who were converging on these kibbutzim all across Israel. Not all were Jews. There were many who weren't. It wasn't a Jewish kind of rite of passage thing.
I think Boris Johnson went to work.
Yeah,
on
I think also.
point, yeah.
Well, there's that as well. But it was done because you felt this is a really interesting thing that they're doing. There was an idealism around that time. It was also the first signs of, peace being made between, Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. And it just seemed really positive and upbeat. If I was 19 again, I know admittedly a difficult concept to think of, would I be heading off to a kibbutz now? I don't think so.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.